Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 293 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. We're glad to have you with us. As I'm recording, it's a very quiet Sunday morning following the bar exam. If you're watching on video, you see that screenshot behind me of an exam room. Kind of gives you the willies, doesn't it? In any event, we are really glad to have you here with us today. If you just finished your February bar exam, congratulations on completing the test. If you're taking the bar exam in July of 2020 or later, again, we're glad to have you with us today. And what we're going to be doing in this episode is actually taking a quick first look at what we're hearing back from students coming out of the February 2020 exams. And then we're going to look at a particular phenomenon that was reported to us, and that is there were a lot of empty seats. Now, not so much in that picture behind me, but there were a lot of missing bar applicants at this last exam. We're going to try and dig into that just a little bit further in today's episode. If this is your first time with us, we want to let you know that we produce these podcast episodes in two formats, video and audio. If you'd like to watch any of our video episodes, just go to celebrationbarreview.com / and then enter the episode number. Today it's 293. So celebrationbarreview.com /293. If you prefer to listen to your podcast, you can do that on Apple Podcasts, on iHeartRadio, radio.com, and virtually any place that podcasts are syndicated. Be sure to subscribe if you're listening on audio form so that you don't miss out on any episodes. And then we come to you just about regularly every week about this same time to talk about all things bar exam related. Now, before we get into a discussion of the February 2020 exams, I want to let you know that our podcast is presented and sponsored by a very special free training program. It's called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. This is a special training program that's designed to take you through the 4 steps that successful repeat bar takers have used to go from failing the exam to passing the exam. It is life-changing information, but it's completely free. And best of all, for me at least, it's on demand, which means you can schedule to watch it anytime you want. All you have to do is click on the button in the show notes, or you can go to celebrationbarreview.com /webinar for more details and to register. And once you've registered, then you'll be able to select the day and time that you want to watch the presentation. If you have questions as you're watching, you can send those to us directly through the app, and we will respond back to you. And it's really terrific information. You'll hear from repeat bar takers in their own words about what they did differently to be successful. So if you have failed the exam previously and you're taking the exam in July 2020 or think you might have to take the exam in July 2020 or later, make sure that you check out Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. All right, well, let's jump into what we've heard as students were coming out of the bar exams in February 2020. We're going to look at the Florida exam, the California exam, the uniform bar exam, and the Georgia exam. Those are 4 obviously pretty big tests. We don't really have anything to tell you specifically about Texas. I will just say that that's an exam that is now going into a phase-out process and will be transitioning to the UBE in February of 2021. No real surprises in Texas, nothing of note to tell you about, so we're not going to take any extra time to talk about Texas today. If we discover something that's of interest there, we will certainly let you know, and good luck to everybody that took that exam. What I want to do, though, is to begin with the Florida bar exam. Florida, as many of you know, is one of the large jurisdictions. Results will come out in Florida on April 13th, and we wish everyone good luck on that exam. Now, the format of the Florida bar exam is that you have 3 one-hour essays in the morning, followed by 90 multiple choice questions on Florida topics, typically in the afternoon, and then you have the multi-state bar exam on the second day. In terms of the essays themselves, the first essays that came out, or the first essay of the morning, was in contracts. It was an employment contract with a non-compete clause, and it had some remedies problems as part of it. In addition, it was a crossover question, and it had some torts in it. So there was multi-state contracts and multi-state torts. there was a tortious interference with contract claim, and there was a defamation claim. So a couple of different things going on there. It was a challenging question from what I've heard from students, definitely, but it was not Florida specific. The second question in Florida was a straight up torts question with a crossover to ethics or professionalism. And this is a fairly typical pattern in Florida to have an ethics or professionalism subpart to a question. The torts part of the question had two different slip and fall situations, some joint tortfeasors, questions about the roles of independent contractors, but essentially it was a negligence problem. The professionalism problem dealt with the advisability of contingency fees and fees to advance living expenses to a plaintiff. So interesting. I don't know how the examiners will choose to characterize this as professional responsibility or professionalism. I'm still not entirely clear what they think that distinction is, but in any event, that was the broad topic of the ethics part of the question. The torts part of the question seemed to be pretty straightforward. The fact pattern was a bit convoluted, although torts questions tend to do that, but seemed again to be pretty straightforward in the reaction we got from students. The third essay of the day did get a lot of reaction from the people that I've talked to. This was a Florida constitutional law question, and it had a lot going on in it. There was a statute that dealt with how to deal with prior sex offenders and where they could live, and then one of them being on a governmental agency, a council. It was an interesting question. There was some discussion about equal protection and dollars that were sent from an incarceration program into schools, and whether or not that was constitutional. There were a lot of different things going on in this question. So the fact pattern, which was relatively long, basically said at the end, what arguments would you make about this ordinance that's being proposed in terms of violating the Florida Constitution, but specifically said, don't talk about preemption by statute. And then, were there any legal barriers to this prior sex offender serving as a member of a board of commissioners? So that was interesting. And then again, there was a crossover to ethics or professionalism. And this time they actually said, discuss the questions of ethics or professionalism. And the reason for that is that there is an ex parte contact with a judge. And the actual call of the question was, discuss any issues of ethics or professionalism regarding an ex parte contact with a judge. So kind of an interesting question. Again, I'm not sure that the examiners even know the difference between ethics or professionalism here. The fact that they use both terms is interesting to me. That question seemed to get the most reaction from students. They seemed to think it was the most difficult of the three, and we'll see how the scoring comes out there. In terms of Florida multiple choice questions, the multiple choice topics were wills, and the second was business entities, with apparently an emphasis in corporations, and the third, as always, was civil and criminal procedure. Now, I think it is of note that in the procedure section, there was no testing of the new rules in Florida, the ones that were enacted as of January 1st, 2020. There were no discussions of timelines, no specifics there, pretty much as we had suspected would be the case. So that's what we had in Florida multiple choice: wills, business entities, and procedure. No great surprises, pretty much the way that we had previewed the exam. I think maybe the biggest surprise to me was Florida con law. And again, kind of an odd question. I'm really anxious to see what the examiners do with that in terms of grading. And then I'll also be curious to see how they decide to classify the crossover in question 2 and 3. Is it ethics? Is it professionalism? Always interesting to kind of see what's going on there. But that's what we've got in Florida. The feedback from students was that it was a challenging test, but not an unfair test. I'm pleased that there was, at least as far as I can tell, no questions that we would describe as trigger questions. You may be aware that in the July 2019 question, there was a question that really was an abortion stand-in using a tattoo parlor, just transferring the name tattoo for abortion. It was a very strange question. And there was a statutory rape question that was really, I thought, very difficult for some people because it was a trigger question. I think they stayed away from that a little more this time. These were pretty straight up kinds of questions, other than the fact that we had a sex offender, but it didn't go very far into what the actual offense was. So that's Florida. Interesting exam, and as always, interesting to see what will happen. Results come out April 13th. By the way, I didn't talk about multi-state yet in Florida, but I'll talk about multi-state generally in just a moment. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about the California exam. California, as always, is the granddaddy of all exams in terms of the number of students taking the test. It's a difficult exam, typically has the lowest pass rates in the country. It's a very tough exam. Results are going to be released, however, on May 8th. Now, this is really interesting, and I know you're like, why would that be interesting? Typically, we don't get results in California until the end of May. So this is nice to be moving the deadlines up. This is one of the things I had suggested last year to the bar examiners, is they needed to get results out sooner. It's just not fair to repeat bar takers to get their results literally within 7 weeks of or 8 weeks of the next bar exam date. May 8th is earlier than California has historically done it. The fact that they announced that date makes me think that, in fact, that's what they're going to do. And I think that's a good revision for them. And frankly, something that should have been coming, given the fact that they went to a 2-day exam. And so what did they test on day one of the California exam? Well, the structure in California is that there are 5 essays and 1 performance test. So it's a long day. The essays are an hour in length, and they can be drawn from a wide variety of subjects. So what we heard from students about the topics that were tested in February of 2020, one of the questions was a torts question. Torts was big apparently this year. It was a defamation question. It asked about defenses and it asked about remedies. Don't think it really was a remedies question so much as it was a torts question that had some remedies discussed within it. Again, pretty straightforward multi-state topic. The second question we think is going to be noted as a remedies question, although it lived in the area of contracts. It had to do with a contract breach and what the potential remedies were for that breach. We think this is going to be a remedies question, the way that the examiners will classify it when they're done. And this is, again, something we see a lot of. You get torts questions, you get contracts questions or property questions, and they might have a remedies section to them. And then you have straight up remedies questions, but obviously remedies have to occur in some context. So it looks like this one was a remedies question in contracts. Third question was not much of a surprise. It was professional responsibility. This is an almost always tested topic in California, and it had a crossover. We heard from some students a crossover to agency. That's kind of interesting. Agency is not a topic you see very often tested, but primarily professional responsibility being the primary part of this question. Then the fourth question was an evidence question. Interesting, and one of the things we are looking at, and perhaps some of you know, and we don't have a whole lot of detail yet, whether or not this was California-specific evidence or the model rules, the MBE rules of evidence. We don't know that yet. Typically what California does is it takes the federal rules of evidence and it uses those. Very rarely do they test specifically California subjects and differences. And then the last essay was business associations. I thought that was particularly interesting if there was some part of the professional responsibility that was agency to have business associations, kind of an interesting take for that as well. And business associations is a question area that gets tested from time to time, certainly with corporations and partnerships. So interesting question there. In terms of the performance test, it was a response to opposing counsel. There was a demand for a submission of a fraud claim to arbitration. So you're writing to a legal audience, and it sounds like you're writing a persuasive document. So this is a pretty common form. The persuasive task to a legal audience is certainly something that the examiners like to test in terms of the form of the exam. So that's what it looks like we've got. Evidence, torts, remedies, contracts, corporations, we think, is in some of that. So the remedies were in contracts, again, to be explicit. We will get more information undoubtedly as we go along. I'll clear up the questions that we've got as we see and hear from more students, and obviously love to get your comments and feedback if you took the Cal Bar in terms of what those questions were. Didn't get a lot of comments from people that said, oh, it was an impossible test, or the questions were obscure, or going for really narrow areas of the law. It seemed to be pretty broad-based and pretty straightforward. So I thought that was good news. And again, I'm excited about that May 8th results deadline. That should be a benefit for people. So that's what we saw in California. Next up, I want to look at the Uniform Bar Exam, the UBE. Now, the UBE is given in more than 30 jurisdictions, and it's governed by the National Conference of Bar Examiners. we are restricted under our license with the NCBE from divulging the specific topics that were on the essays at this point in time. So I'm not going to do that. I'm not quite sure why the NCBE is so concerned about telling people what was on the test after it's over, but we have to honor those agreements. And so I'm not going to give you the specifics here, but what I am going to say is that there are 6 half-hour essays, and they are drawn from the 7 multi-state subjects and then 7 other MEE subjects, multi-state essay exam subjects. What was interesting in this exam to me is that we had a preponderance of questions, as typical, that came from the multi-state bar exam topics. That is, out of the 7 MBE topics, we had a number of those tested in the exam itself as essay questions as well. The other interesting pattern that we saw is the area of whether or not there are crossover questions. In this exam, we had at least one question that we think was a crossover, and most of the questions, however, stayed in a single topic. Some of the questions appeared to be actually pretty straightforward and simple. In fact, we had some people that contacted us and said, I was really kind of struggling for, what the 3 or more topics might be that the examiners were testing, because typically in the UBE, you're going to have 3 issues or 3 topics, 3 discussions that you need to have in every question. Some of those questions were so straightforward that it was hard to know specifically what the examiners were looking at. So I thought that that was an interesting take on the essays themselves. We did not get feedback from UBE students that the essays were particularly difficult. In fact, quite the opposite. We heard a lot of positive feedback that it was very straightforward, pretty much well-tested and well-prepared areas within these specific topics, and not too unusual, not too off the wall, which is what we've come to expect of the UBE. So I'm excited about that. I'm pleased that those questions seem to be as direct and straightforward as they were. And when we're able to announce what those topics were, we'll let you know. I'm sure you can find them, but we're not the ones that are going to be able to tell you. Now, as you know, there are 2 performance tests as well on the exam. We can tell you, because those performance tests came from other jurisdictions, a little bit about those, and we'll do that in a minute when we talk about the Georgia exam. But essentially, there was an objective task to a legal audience and a persuasive task to a legal audience. These are the 2 most common forms of the performance test, and so no surprises as far as that goes. One other interesting thing that we heard from some students was that the examiners started using a character limit if you were typing rather than a word limit. I thought that was kind of an interesting modification. 7,500 to 8,000 character limit for the performance tests and 3,000 to 4,000 characters typically on the essays. So that was something we had not seen before. Another interesting sort of weird part of the exam is that historically it's been performance tests in the morning and then essays in the afternoon. For some reason, that was switched up this year, and apparently they led with the essays in the morning, performance tests in the afternoon. If you were in a UBE jurisdiction and that was different than that, I'd love to hear from you. But so far as I know, that was the structure everywhere around the country. Now, obviously, each jurisdiction in the UBE grades their own exams and produces their own results. One of the early states that will give results will be North Carolina out of the UBE. That comes typically about 5 weeks after the exam is given. So we should have those results in very early April. And then we roll all the way through the season. New York, of course, is one of the big UBE jurisdictions, and they typically don't announce their results. They just put them out. You get an email saying when it's coming. I usually get a tingly spidey sense before it's about to happen, but we would not normally expect those until sometime in May, so we'll keep you informed there. When UBE results start to come out from those early jurisdictions, it's usually a pretty good bellwether for what's coming in the bigger states later, so we'll keep an eye on those early results out of some of the UBE states and let you know as each of those jurisdictions reports their results. So that's what we know about the UBE. We still, again, haven't talked about the multi-state. I'm getting there. Next up, we want to talk about the Georgia exam. Georgia is really a tough exam, I got to tell you. Georgia has a 2-day test. Day 1, there are 4 essays and 2 performance tests. So it's a long, long day. The essays are 45 minutes in length as compared to the 30-minute UBE essays or the 60-minute California and Florida essays. In Georgia, the 4 essays were challenging, I think. Question 1 was a straight-up professional responsibility question having to do with solicitation of clients. And I don't think the reaction I got from students was that was pretty straightforward. People didn't seem to have much difficulty with that. Conflicts of interest and recruiting clients, soliciting for clients are pretty standard topics in that subject. The second question was a wills question. It had to deal with a pledge given to a college, I think it was, and then the donor wants to revoke the pledge, and then the donor dies, and then the executor has to decide how to stop the pledge to the college. And dealing with donative intent, I think, and how do you legally stop donations that have been made? And so that was an interesting question. Certainly not the most commonly tested topic within wills, so I thought it was a bit of a challenge. I'll be interested to see what happens. Now, Georgia is not a state that tells us any detail when they give out results about what's coming or how they graded them, but I will be anxious to see some answers from students and see what we've got there. Question 3 was the one that got the most attention in Georgia. This was a domestic relations question. And typically domestic relations is not all that difficult, pretty straightforward. But this one had, I think, 7 or 8 different calls of the question, some of which were extremely narrow, like what's the minimum age to marry and what are the elements of a valid marriage? This was a very odd kind of question, but it also really turned on common law marriage and on paternity and on child support. So there were some basic family law, domestic relations kinds of problems, but then there was also some very sort of nerdy procedural things that went with it. And the question apparently took a lot of people a long time to answer because it was so lengthy. Hard to imagine in 45 minutes that you could have covered everything that the examiners felt and thought should be there. So that was surprising to me, and we'll see what comes of that. But that seemed to be very difficult. Then the fourth question may have been actually the hardest question, but I have a feeling, at least in talking to students, the ones that I talked to seem to get sucked in by the family law question and then really be struggling to have quite enough time. So maybe 40 minutes or 35 minutes for the last essay, which was a civil procedure question. It looks to me like Georgia civil procedure. It was a class action suit and had to talk about how you created a class action suit and perhaps get into federal court. I couldn't tell specifically from the feedback, so be anxious to see the question when it comes out specifically. But it's a consumer in Georgia who's filing a suit against a company in Utah, but they're in Georgia court. So we'll see what happens there. That question caused a lot of problems, it appears. I heard a lot of feedback from people that was difficult, and they felt really rushed, particularly after the domestic relations question. So that was an interesting one, and we'll see what happens with that. All right, now Georgia also uses the multi-state performance tests. And again, I'm not going to be super specific here out of deference to the national conference. Just want to say that one of the performance tests was a memorandum, had to deal with going to a legal audience. It was objective, so very much in the traditional style of an objective memorandum, having a very straightforward response. The second performance test was closing arguments to a judge. So you're writing to a legal audience and it is persuasive. This approach of a closing argument or a brief or a motion to the court, again, very common form. So those two forms of the exam, an objective task to a legal audience and a persuasive task to a legal audience, are the two most common forms, and they were what the national conference put out. So those would have been the two on the UBE as well. And then some jurisdictions use one or the other of the performance tests, but in Georgia they use both. In terms of results in Georgia, we would expect those in mid-May. So after California, we would think this year. So it's a late result date in Georgia as well. We'll see what happens. Georgia doesn't give much information. There's a minimum threshold of 115 on the multi-state in order to even get a reported essay grade, and then the examiners don't give you a breakout in Georgia by question, just a total score. Again, most of our students felt good about 3 of the questions, struggled, I think, some of them with the 4th question in civil procedure, mostly because of time, I think, as I heard back from students. All right, what about the multi-state bar exam? Across the country, the 200-question test given on Wednesday. Well, I held it for the end because really there's not a whole lot to say about it. It was a very standard multi-state exam. We didn't hear people responding about any really strange off-the-wall questions, although strange off-the-wall questions are typically the ones that are being put in for evaluation purposes. by the examiners. There were no great surprises that I'm aware of, no responsive problems where people felt like the questions were unusual in the way they were formed or what they were asking for. Our students responded, I think, pretty well to the MBE. Most of our students tell me that they finished the exam in anywhere from 2 hours to 2.5 hours, to maybe some 2 hours and 45 minutes, but I have not heard from any of our students who were unable to finish their 100 questions in each of the 3-hour periods. Now, we know that part of that is that we teach this process of selective intuition. We got a lot of great responses from students saying it really made a difference for them. They felt very confident. Students telling us that they felt like they had gotten 70, 80% of the questions where they were very confident that they knew the answer and were able to answer it quickly and move on. So that's all good news. We're excited about that. We're excited that the numbers look as good as they do there. And we'll see what happens as results come in. But the multi-state, when, no news is always good news for me. And so when I don't hear people screaming and raging and saying, oh my God, some strange thing happened, that's a good piece as far as I'm concerned. Well, now I want to pivot to something that we started hearing really on Tuesday afternoon and sort of build up throughout Tuesday, Wednesday, and even Thursday, in hearing back from students of ours who were at the exam site in different sites, different exams all over the country. We started hearing from people saying, there's a weird thing going on. There are a whole lot of empty seats at my testing center, seats that have name tags on them or name plaques on them or materials waiting, and no one's showing up. Now, that's not something that ever gets remarked on. I mean, there's an occasional no-show, but typically when you've paid the money and made the travel arrangements and done the studying and so on, you expect someone's going to come to the exam. So this wasn't just isolated, and it wasn't just a handful. In some test centers, we heard students telling us that there were, large test centers where they saw plenty of seats open, a couple in one row, 3 in another row, and 15, 20, 30 empty seats in a room of 100 people. Now, I'm not suggesting there's a 30% no-show rate, but I am saying that the no-show rate is dramatically higher than we've seen it before. And I wanted to explore why that might be so. And this is all speculation. We have no reason to know what's exactly happened, but there was enough going on in enough different jurisdictions that it really raises a red flag. And I wanted to make you aware of it as a watcher or a listener of this podcast, because I think it may be a leading trend in a couple of areas. So as I've thought about it over the weekend as to why there might be this high number of no-shows, I've got a couple of different thoughts in mind. The first one, obviously, would be health concerns. As we're recording, the coronavirus is starting to take hold in the U.S. and certainly has created a foothold around the world. And it may well be that there were people who decided that being in a large environment with folks who had been probably not sleeping and not taking good care of themselves physically might not be the best thing for themselves, and decided to sit out and not take this exam. Now, I think that may be much more of a question when we get to the July test than it was for this exam, because we're really just at the leading edge of whatever's going on with coronavirus. But I don't think we can ignore entirely that there may have been some people who didn't want to come. There may also have been some people who had the flu or whatever particular illness is there. As I'm reading today, I can't tell the difference between flu and coronavirus. So maybe there were people that literally were just too sick to come to the exam. That always happens a little bit in February, and we know it's there, but this seems to be bigger than that. So I think that's one possibility. Another possibility always in the February exam, particularly in jurisdictions that have test centers in snowy, cold areas, is that weather just may make it too difficult to get there. There was no massive storm this year like we had a year ago or a couple of years ago, and yet weather can be a factor for some people and may have been a reason that some people stayed away. It certainly wasn't a reason for people to not be in Florida or California, and we saw a lot of empty seats in both of those jurisdictions as well. Another possibility is that there are travel restrictions in place. We know that for foreign trained attorneys, it's more difficult sometimes to get into and out of the United States. It may not have been possible to get in to take their exams. And so we want to encourage those of you that are foreign trained and coming in from another country for the exam to make sure that all of your travel arrangements are made and that you have all of your required documentation, and give yourself some extra time to get into the U.S. prior to the upcoming exam. So those are all sort of big picture questions about health, weather, and travel restrictions. We'll see what happens there. But I want to suggest two other reasons that I think may be more at heart of what's going on even than those. One of the things that I think that I'm seeing more frequently is a level of discouragement, particularly among repeat bar takers. There is no doubt that the repeat bar taker world is getting bigger and bigger. It's consuming more and more of the bar takers, particularly on the February exam. I think we'll see when the results come in that there were more repeat bar takers than first-time takers nationally. And given that fact, I think that discouragement really becomes a factor. There are people who enroll for the exam, they study, and then they get discouraged and think to themselves, why am I bothering? Why should I even come to the exam or take the test? The odds of my passing are going to be so low. I had one student of ours who told me that while they were waiting in line to get into a UBE test, the person in front of them said, this jurisdiction only has a 20% pass rate for repeat bar takers. Probably heard it on my podcast. But the point is that instead of seeing that as an opportunity and how do you do something different to get into that 20%, which is precisely what our student said, she said back to them, I'm in that 20%. This student was incredibly discouraged and had already, I think, probably given up before they walked in the door. I think that discouragement may be a real factor for people who decided to sit out the exam. Maybe they made their reservations, they paid for their fee for the exam, but they were so discouraged and so frustrated by the process that they gave up. If you're one of those people or you felt that way, I want to talk to you very specifically here. You do not need to be discouraged and you do not need to give up. Our website is filled with case studies of people who have failed the exam and then passed. In some cases, a couple of times before they passed. In some cases, as much as 30 years of taking the bar before they passed. But it is possible to pass the exam. The tools exist, the resources exist, the approaches exist that work. And we're living proof of that for 30 years. We've been helping people pass their exams. So if you're feeling discouraged, I want to invite you to set up a consultation with me. There's a free link to set that up on our show notes page. And I really encourage you to take advantage of that. Talk to me if you took the exam about that exam. And if you want to just talk about where you go in the future, we'd be glad to do that too. So I invite you to take advantage of that if you're feeling that discouragement. And also become a regular listener or watcher of this podcast. We talk a lot about how you can turn that around. In fact, we just finished a series talking about the human potential movement and some thought reversal techniques that are incredibly powerful. And I will say that our students and our focus at Celebration Bar Review, which is primarily repeat bar takers. So I'm mostly working with people that would be in that cohort. The response I got back from students after the February exam was almost uniformly positive. People were very excited, felt very relaxed, very calm, very confident about the work, even when they had previously not been successful. So I think it's possible to overcome that discouragement, but I think it's naive to assume that that is not a factor in people not coming. Now, another thing we saw that was really interesting, at least reported to us by our students, is that there were far fewer people coming into many of the exams on Wednesday after the Tuesday essay day. Now, that's not because they don't have to take the multi-state. These were jurisdictions where you had to sit both days, but because they simply just didn't show up. And I think you can only attribute that to discouragement. And so if you felt that discouragement, if you went to day one of the exam and didn't come back for day two, well, definitely let's talk and talk about how you can change that and do something different. So I think discouragement is out there. I think it's a real thing. I think that the amount of discussion about pass rates has been very discouraging for people. But I think it's important to know the numbers, but also to know that there's ways to overcome those numbers. And we will continue to fight on behalf of repeat bar takers and certainly to help you get past discouragement and get into success. The third and final broad reason that I think people might not have shown up at the exam may be a timing problem. It may simply be that because results come out too late in the year from the previous exam, that there were people who registered for the next test but simply didn't feel like they had enough time to prepare. If you were in a jurisdiction like California, you got relatively little time, certainly 6 to 7 weeks less time than some other jurisdictions to prepare for your retake. And I think that this is really a two-part problem. I do think it takes more time than just 7 weeks to prepare for a bar exam, particularly if you're a repeater. But the other part of this is that I think it comes to a mindset. I think the mindset that you've got to consider here is, am I trying to fill up an empty bucket of knowledge, in which case, and there are some big holes in that bucket, and so I pour water in, I pour knowledge in, and it seeps out, and I put more knowledge in, and it seeps out, and you never feel like you catch up, and so timing always seems like a problem, as compared to people that already know that they have all of the information they need. It's already available in their brain, in their whole mind, and they simply have to learn how to use it. The people that take the latter approach don't have timing problems in preparation because they are literally already aware that they have the information and they are learning how to use what they've already got. But the people that feel like they don't have enough information, they're at a deficit, they need to learn more or know more, always feel like they need more time. And those are typically the people, when we look at who defers out of the exam, it is typically the people that take that approach of, I just need to know more. And no matter how hard you try to convince them that they already know enough, if they're convinced that they don't know it, then there's a real problem. So that's why we've talked about this idea of learning how to use what you already have versus trying to continue to fill up what's missing. And when you take this approach of using what you already have, which comes from your bar review, it comes from law school, it comes from practicing law, it comes from life. When you use all of that, you're ready and you don't need to worry about how much time you've got. Now, is it nice to have more time than 6 or 7 weeks to prepare? Absolutely. But I suspect that was a factor in people registering for the exam and then not showing up. So those are some things that we see. Maybe you've got some ideas. I'd love to hear from you if you've got some thoughts about that. If you did see a lot of empty seats at your exam center, we'd like to hear about that as well. As I say, we heard these reports from all over the country, from UBE jurisdictions around the country, from Florida, from California. We heard it in Georgia. We heard it in Texas. So no doubt in my mind, it was a national phenomenon. And I'm going to be anxious to see what happens and what discussion we've got, and perhaps what the bar examiners themselves even say as to why we had so many no-shows. All right, well, that's our first quick take on what's going on. As always, this is always subject to change as we talk to more students and hear from more people about their exams, get more information. If you did take the exam, again, we want to wish you the very best on the results when they come out. If you didn't take the exam and you're getting ready for July, I want to just remind you about our webinar. You can get the details at celebrationbarreview.com/webinar, or just click in the show notes to reserve your date and time and find out how to do something different and make the next bar exam your last bar exam. Hope everybody's having a good beginning to March and their spring. We'll look forward to being back with you next week. We've got lots more information about the bar exam and about how to prepare, and we'll start to focus in on the July tests while we're waiting for those February results to come in. So take care, everybody. We'll see you next week along the Extra Mile.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.